Hey everyone, hope you can hear me okay. Hope you're all having a good start of the day and the user group has started off well and you're all getting on with the networking and all the other fun stuff. So today I'm going to talk a bit about Sitecore 9. Hopefully you've all heard that it's been released fairly recently, not too long ago. And so I'm going to walk through some of the features, talk through some of the features, and I'll dive into a couple of them just to show you some hands-on usage of those features. Hopefully, a lot of you know me. My name is Kamruz Jaman. I'm a technology MVP for the past 5 years now, since 2013. I blog at jammycam.wordpress.com, and hopefully most of you might know me from Twitter, Slack, Stack Exchange, and Stack Overflow. I use the handle jammycam. So hopefully you've heard of me from before. I may have even spoken to a lot of you online, I'm sure. So 9, the big release. It's been quite a while since we've had a major release. I think the last one was 2014. The last big release was 2014. Obviously, we've had a couple of minor releases along the way. Obviously, they weren't too minor because there was some big functionality in 8.1 and 8.2 as well. But 9 is here, and there is lots of new stuff coming out in number 9. Just a very quick bit of overview. There's some requirement changes. We've got a new installation framework. There's some search stuff that's gone in. There's been some big overhaul within the configuration sections. We've got some authentication stuff, dynamic placeholders, XConnect, forms, marketing automation, JavaScript services. These are just some of the stuff. There's a bunch of other minor things in there. I'll cover a bunch of these stuff throughout this presentation and dive into a couple of them. So one of the first things is the requirements, the prerequisites and requirements. If you've looked through the installation notes, you'll now see that SQL Server, Windows Server 2016 is now supported. Encouraged, I'd almost say as well. It is obviously Windows Server 2016 has been around for a while. A lot of the Azure templates are obviously Windows Server 2016 as well, and you get a bunch of nice stuff in there. Things like HTTP2 support, which if you're running over HTTPS will mean that you get multiplexing and all that other good stuff, which will help with browser requests and that kind of stuff. A lot of us locally will be running a non-server version. So Windows 10 and 8.1 are the official requirements. You'll notice there's no Windows 7 on here, which may mean that you need to think about upgrading your developer machines and maybe some of your sales staff and people on the road that maybe running demo sites and that kind of stuff. Along with that, there's a requirement for IIS 8.5 minimum. They've also upped the .NET framework, so we're kind of on the latest for web forms at least. Anyway, it's .NET 4.6.2. Obviously, there's been a few other C# releases on the way, but this is the latest .NET framework at the moment. We've also got some changes for SQL Server. The official supported version is SQL Server 2016. If you're running, you can get away with running SQL Server 2014 if you're running in XM, Experience Management mode, or CMS only mode. You will need SQL Server 2016 for the full experience platform mode, so that's with all the analytics and everything else. big news is the analytics XDB is now natively supported on SQL Server. So you don't actually need MongoDB. And actually for this initial release, there is no MongoDB support. But in a future release in the update 1, they said there's going to be Mongo support as well as Cosmos DB in Azure. So that's the old document DB as it was known. So lots of nice options in there. Again, if you still have Windows SQL Server 2012's servers, you're going to have to upgrade those. If you're running locally for your developers, SQL Server 2016 Developer Edition is free without an MSDN license, and it's available from the Microsoft site. So don't worry about running on Express mode and that kind of stuff. And finally, especially for us running locally, we need to be running Solr. It's always been good best practice to run Solr, especially on the scaled environment where you have multiple CM and CD servers. Now it's a requirement if you're running the full XP version of Sitecore with all the analytics and everything else running. If you're running on CMS only mode, you can get away with Lucene, but that's a single server. If you don't want to use Solr, you can use Azure Search. That's also supported out of the box. So Sitecore have been making some changes within the platform itself. You've noticed over time with things like the publishing service, these have become separate modules. With things like commerce, these are separate from Sitecore. And as this release has grown, there's a few additional services which Sitecore plugs into. And Sitecore, I think, rightly has taken the approach of being secure by default. So all the communication between the CM and Solr and XConnect, which we'll talk to a bit later, is all done over HTTPS by default. It's a best practice anyway. Everyone is suggesting even on your front-end servers, you run HTTPS. The browsers have, for the past few versions, been showing up warnings. Those are not secure warnings. And if you have logon forms and sensitive information on pages, the browsers will warn a bit more harshly, and it will get worse. So it's best practice to run it on the front end anyway. Sitecore have moved that and taken it across the back end as well, and across the different services that are set up in the back end. It is a requirement for compliance with a lot of data protection laws, particularly general data protection regulation in the EU and associated right to be forgotten. So with all the customer information and the personally identify information within XConnect, I think it's a good move, and it's what we should be doing anyway. So the data is encrypted at rest. So like I said, it's all the traffic is over HTTPS, and it's data it's encrypted in motion, and it is encrypted at rest. So the data within XConnect, the XDB, is encrypted as well. So that adds an extra layer of protection against hackers and potentially losing sensitive information. Again, there's been a lot of news, particularly within the past few months, of big data hacks, a lot of data being lost. So if it's encrypted, that just adds that extra layer of protection. That does mean you're going to have to obtain some SSL certificates. Locally, at least, you can self-sign them. There's a bunch of articles which I'll show you a few later, which will help set up locally at least, and there's been quite a lot of work from the community in getting this all set up. To get this all set up, particularly locally, it's different. It's a lot different than a lot of us have been used to over the past several years. Sitecore is no longer providing an exe file, so you can't go to dev.sitecore.net and download the exe and just click and have it install. That's gone. You can still download the web root, the zip web root. That's still downloadable, but the recommended approach is to actually download the packages which Sitecore have provided. If you guys have been using Azure, particularly the PaaS option, then it's the same similar package, so you'll be familiar with those packages. But those packages aren't supported by Sitecore Sim, the Sitecore installation manager that a lot of us have been using, particularly for local installations, for throwaway ones. So for now, at least, it's goodbye to Sim and hello to SIF, the Sitecore installation framework. It's a brand new framework, completely from scratch, and it uses PowerShell. It's a PowerShell module essentially, which will help automate the entire framework. That will help you deploy and configure a standard set of configurations of the server architectures, so your standalones and your CMs and your CDs and that kind of stuff. The framework can be extended. It is just PowerShell functions, and because it can be extended, it means that you can script out the environments as you want. So it's not just a case of, hey, install Sitecore. You can go and plug a bunch of your own PowerShell modules in there to configure a bunch of additional services if you wanted, or just simple things like maybe setting folder permissions or creating backup folders, or whatever you want to do as part of your initial Windows installation. It doesn't go as far as desired state configuration. It's a step before that, which I think it makes it a little bit easier, because it will allow us to individually run this framework on individual machines without having to have a big upfront setup. And of course, because it is PowerShell, it can integrate with our own deployment processes. Most deployment frameworks will allow to run PowerShell steps either before or after or during, even to spin up new environments, and you can just go ahead and run the SIF framework with whatever scripts that you need, and you have a brand new environment set up. So it should make our DevOps lives a bit easier in the longer run. We'll just have to take a little bit of pain initially to pick up this new framework and this new way of working. The framework itself, you can download it from the from Sitecore's PowerShell repository. Just launch a PowerShell window and run the register command, and then install modules, Sitecore install framework. If you guys haven't seen these, I would suggest taking a look at these posts. One of the other MVPs, Jeremy Davis, has written a post on installing Solr, because you will need to install Solr with SSL certificates, and then you got to generate the SSL certificates, and you got to put that into the Windows certificate store and trusted and a bunch of other things. So Jeremy has written a script. It's just a PowerShell script. You can just go ahead, run it. It will download Solr. It will download NSSM. It will install Solr. It will create the certs, and it will have Solr run as a Windows service on startup. Another MVP, Rob Anaheim, has written a Windows GUI interface called Sifless, He's got a bunch of posts on his blog post. I suggest you could take a look at that as well. It will allow you to run a UI over the Sitecore installation framework, and then you just plug in your like the folder location, where your license file is, and a few other variables, and just hit go, and it will go and install Sitecore 9, XConnect, set up IIS, and add your host file entry and all that other stuff. The things that Sim used to do at a basic level, but with those two scripts, you can probably get Sitecore 9 up and running within about 15 or 20 minutes. But do take a look at the documentation. Documentation is very, very good, so that will help you out as well. There's also a Sitecore 9 installation series on YouTube by Alan Pellin. He works at Sitecore, and he is the person who wrote Sitecore Sim, as well as a bunch of other frameworks. So take a look at those. Really, really good frameworks. Read the documentation. There's a bunch of stuff in there around the minimum requirements. You will require like PowerShell 5.1 to be installed. If you're running Windows 10, be careful. You need to update to the anniversary edition. Otherwise, you can't get PowerShell 5.1, and therefore you can't run SIF. There's a couple of other requirements. Check the documentation, or there's a few blog posts out as well, pointing all those out. So there's also been some changes to search. I mentioned earlier, Solr is now a requirement for XConnect, or you can use as your search if you're in the cloud. There was also some enhancements to the content search API, which have come through. They've added support for. They've added a new API supporting Solr spell check, suggester, highlight, more like this. So all those things where most people are expecting to be part of a search platform these days, instead of just a fairly straightforward basics thing. So it's nice to get these out of the box. I think a lot of people were probably using these anyway in the background, but it's nice that there's support and an API directly built in now. And this will hopefully make search a much more central part of the platform for yourself, for your users, and instead of having to head back over to Google to try and find search results back on your own site. So one of the big changes in 9 is the configuration. The current configuration in Sitecore is troublesome, to put it nicely. It's really, really complicated. You need a different set of configs for your local machine. You need a different set of configurations for a CM server. You need a different set of configurations for the CD servers. Yeah, different ones still for processing and reporting. And this starts to become really, really complicated. If you read the Sitecore documentation, it's just several pages of which files to enable and which files to disable. Then there's the Excel spreadsheet, which then has a fairly what looks like complex matrix of what should be enabled and what should be disabled, and then you miss one, or the spreadsheet is incorrect sometimes, and then you have these combinations of servers, and it starts to get quite complicated. And it also makes your deployment processes complicated, because you're having to have several steps within your deployment process just to configure what type of server you have. And then on top of that, you have switching from Lucene to Solr to Azure. You've then got to go back and enable, disable, a whole bunch of stuff. So the good news is we have some new stuff. So the configuration in Sitecore 9 is simple, like really, really simple. It's just a single setting to configure a server for a particular type of role. But they've gone further. We've now got a bunch of additional patch folders. There's Sitecore have moved all their own, or all the default Sitecore configuration into its separate folder. There's another folder for modules, which is meant for people who are creating modules for the marketplace, or things like the PowerShell extensions, for example, would go into this modules folder. So any of those modules can go into there, and then we have the custom folder, and that's meant for your own configurations, stuff that you're developing in your own projects. This is actually, custom folder is actually just the include folder, the current include folder. So for most people, you shouldn't have to do much. And then we got an additional one, which is an environment folder, which is meant for things like putting overrides for your UAT and test and pre-prod environments, for example, or local, that kind of stuff. They've also added a feature to allow you to control the load order of all the configurations. So you can get really, really granular. I'll show you this in a few seconds. And it also allows you to easily switch search provider, just like you can configure a server for a role. You can easily switch search providers just the same way. So how do you configure this stuff? Quite simply, in the web.config file, there's a couple of keys in the app settings. One is role define. The default out of the box is standalone, but you can set that value to content delivery, content management, processing, and reporting. Those are the available values, but you could set your own if you wanted to. You can have an additional environment if you really, really wanted to. So to change that to a content delivery, you simply just switch that setting to content delivery. There's another value there you can see for search defined. Again, just as simple to switch between Solr and Azure. You just change that to one single value, and the configs just magically change. The way it works is each config node that needs to change for particular roles, you can add an additional attribute on those and tag those nodes up. You've got four ways of doing this. Well, 4 available operators to do this, should I say. So the first one you can see here is I have a content management or standalone. These are just some ones I'm just showing as examples, but you get the idea. This value will be true if this role is defined as content management here, or it's standalone. For any of these other environments at this stage, it would be this would be set. But obviously, you can have combinations of set a default and then role require for one of these to override. So it's kind of like patching the value within the same configuration file, if you like. There's also an AND operator if you somehow have the need in this particular use case. So if in this case, this value would only apply to a content management and processing environment. You can also use grouping. So in this case, you can see these brackets here. So it would apply to standalone environment, or if the environment was tagged up as content management and processing. And you can do that by passing through comma separated roles here. Probably wouldn't want to do that, but you could if you if you wanted to. There's also one last one, which is a not operator. So in this case, it would be all the other types of environments, not standalone. And for search, you can see that the search attribute here is slightly different than these role requires. As you can see, it's a search require. and that matches this key that we have defined up here. In this case, it's set at quite a higher level node. So if I switch this value to Lucene, this entire node would not apply, everything within it. So it's not just singular values, you can do entire node sets with this configuration grouping. So another new, feature of the configuration is config load order. It's the old classic, which came first, the chicken or the egg. We all know with Sitecore, configs are loaded alphabetically, so it will start from the root config folder, the include folder it used to be, and it would alphabetically load all the configs within that, and then alphabetically go through each of the folders. Fortunately, this led to a bit of a problem with Helix solutions, particularly because Foundation is later alphabetically than feature. So if you had a feature in a Foundation folder, the feature configs would load first. We could work around this by doing a dot feature or a dot foundation, or a 1 dot foundation and a 2 dot feature, or something like that. So this new changes are pretty nice. There's a layers.config file within the app config folder now, and within that you can specify load orders. It will allow you to specify which specific order folders are loaded in. So Sitecore has moved all its own configuration to its app config folder, and they have been quite nice and organized everything within subfolders themselves. So if we go into the include folder, not the include folder, we go into the Sitecore folder now, you can see there's a whole heap of different folders in here. And of course, these are alphabetical, but Sitecore themselves don't necessarily want to load these in that particular order. So you now have, for example, cms.core will load before anti-CSRFM module folder. So that will allow you to do the same with your custom folder. Unfortunately, this isn't in the default configuration that comes in Sitecore. So if you are working on a Helix project, I suggest you add this in yourself, and you can then specify the load order of Foundation feature project. If you have specific config files that you want to load before other ones, you can also do that. You could load a file tucked away in a subfolder before all the folders if you wanted to, for example. Just put the file name in and specify the type as file. You may have noticed that these are the 4 layers that I was speaking about earlier. So Sitecore, modules, custom, and you'll notice custom is the include folder, and environment. If you wanted to, for some reason, add another layer in here, you could just copy this line, for example, give it a unique name, point it to somewhere else. Maybe you have a common framework that you're using across all your projects, so you could create an additional framework layer, for example, point that to before there, and then for each individual project that you're using that framework in, you can then go ahead and helix on top of a helix almost, if you wanted to, for example. Yeah, just specify. So I just told you about those files. It's also possible to define a custom role. So kind of like those search configuration, just add in an additional key in the web config under the app settings. So in this particular case, there's a key with env environment. I defined it as UAT. And then in your own configurations, make sure you add this namespace. This key here needs to match the key here. and this part of the URL of the namespace needs to match again. And then you can just start tagging up your config attributes again, your config nodes again with this attribute. So in this case, it's env require. The standard two are role require and search require. So this allows you to manage your configs within a single file, but do remember you have that environments folder if you want to use it that way, and then have it removed or deleted or something using your deploy process. One thing I did forget to mention is if you want to disable a layer, let's say you're having a problem with your project and you're not quite sure if it's your own configs or Sitecore's config, you can add a mode equals off into any of these layers, and it will turn that, it will disable that entire layer. You can obviously still follow that old way of disabling individual files with a dot disabled or a dot example, or making the file hidden. That still works as well. So another new feature in Sitecore 9 is federated authentication. The authentication options in Sitecore have been quite limited over time. The only things we really had were the old AD module, and that's obviously very, very dated now, and authentication mechanisms have changed hugely over the past few years, and a lot of people are asking for things like single sign-on. It's a very, very common request. So Sitecore has now implemented this using Owen middlewares. It has a support for a whole bunch of different authentication providers out of the box. So you've got your usual Google, Facebook, Twitter. You can add up with Azure AD, and then there's some open protocols such as OAuth and SAML. You can also go and create your own custom middleware if you really wanted to. There's various reasons that you might want to do that. And the users can be either virtual users or users persisted in the membership database. This means that you can use authentication to log users both into the front end of your site and the CMS using any of these authentication providers. And since you can log people into the front end using things like Facebook and Google, it's obviously allowing you to identify your contacts and then collect much richer information and data about those users, and then use the analytics to actually start driving better experiences for your visitors. And obviously, single sign-on is a big one. If your users can use single sign-on, it's going to make their lives a lot easier in having to remember passwords. Also makes your life easier because you don't then have to manage all these authentication providers in the background. You don't have to manage your own Azure AD for the users. You can just have them use a federated identification system from the background. Suggest having a read of this blog post by Baz Lichten. He has written a few posts on authentication. He actually wrote a Owen middlewares layer for Sitecore 8 something or other. So he's written a new post on Sitecore 9 and the federated authentication, and he has actually gone and created a custom provider using Auth0 as the identity broker, and that just allowed him to use auth0, and then auth0 would act as a as the identity provider, give him one single connection that he needs to connect to, and then he can just log into their portal and just enable and disable a whole bunch of different providers. So worth a read. It will give you some more insights into the kind of things that are possible with this new authentication mechanism. Dynamic placeholders. This is the #1 requested feature since forever. Nick Wesselman wrote a post on this way back in 2011. It's the most requested feature on both of the user voice sites, and it's finally done. It's nice. I'm sure most of us have been using something or other, probably something like Fortis or dynamic placeholders module. It does a lot of the same things. It's a dynamic placeholders. There's nothing particularly magic about that, but this does add in a bunch of additional things, which makes it a much more extensible. It will allow you to use the experience editor, so you can set some rendering parameters to do things like the count of the number of placeholders you want displayed. So you can obviously here I've typed these in, but if you had a parameters template, it could just be a drop-down value, and the user can just switch between, I want 3 placeholders, I want 6 placeholders. You can also then start passing in additional parameters, things like I want to override the CSS class that's been added to the markup for the placeholder itself. You've got things like the keys are generated using pipelines. If you needed to extend that, you could. It is MVC only, so if you're using web forms, then you're out of luck. But if you're starting a new project, then you probably shouldn't be using web forms in this day and age. There are some, so I did want to show you a quick bit of code on this. Let me just pull that up. I'll just pull this up very, very quickly. So at a very, very basic level, it's, as you'd expect, you just call the Sitecore helper, dynamic placeholder helper, and then just pass in whatever your key is. If you have multiple placeholders within the same rendering, then you need to seed them, and this will essentially increment the placeholder key, because each placeholder doesn't know about each other. If you have multiple like this, you could not bother with something like that, and then what you could do is use a tag builder function. So here it will call this tag builder function, which will then just return the markup. So the same as what you see here, just call a div and added some CSS class. In this particular case, you can go a bit cleverer. So I can add in a count, and I can add in a max count, and that will then allow the user to override these placeholder counts from the experience editor, but I'm also limiting how many they can have. You can start to get a bit clever with these, since these are functions. You can, for example, if you needed to add an extra class on every third one, you could do that. You could grab what the index is if you wanted to. If you wanted to do something on specific index counts, like I've done here, you can grab the total number of placeholders. You can add additional attributes if you wanted to, for example. If you wanted to pass in additional parameters, you can do. For example, if you wanted to pass in a CSS class, then you can just use this format within the rendering parameters. So it'll be ph underscore, whatever your placeholder key is, and then whatever your key of this parameter is. So in this case, I can grab this key from here, for example, and then use it within my code if I wanted to add something on specific ones. You can also do it for specific counts of a placeholder. So if you wanted to pass in a different class here on the third occurrence of the placeholder, then you can just pass it in like this. So this is like a count. I do have a blog post of this in my site, so have a look, have a read. I've gone through quite a lot of stuff in there. Also, go take a look at this post by Richard Seal. He's got a couple of posts on this as well. He's also got a script on this blog post on migrating from Fortis to this new version of the placeholders in Sitecore. XConnect, this is big news. XConnect is making a lot of headlines at the moment, rightly so. So with the existing XDB architecture, everything's kind of tied together. All the different types of servers talk to the different reporting databases and the collection databases directly. There's a dependency on the Sitecore kernel, because you need to have a CM or a reporting or a whatever instance deployed in order to do anything XDB related. If you want to send some data from from other devices, they've all got to talk to XDB through the content management or the content delivery servers, for example. XConnect changes this. It's a brand new service layer that sits between the collection databases and the reporting data and the search databases in XConnect, and everything talks to the XConnect server via the APIs. So if the content management wants to do something with the XDB, it will talk via the XConnect server. Same with the content delivery servers, and same with all the reporting databases and everything else. Everything talks to the server via the APIs. Communication is over HTTPS. As I mentioned earlier, that XConnect requires is set up by default using HTTPS at rest and over the wire. And what this does mean that if you have some custom apps, some mobile apps, some non-Sitecore apps, and they can also start pushing data into XConnect via the APIs. There is a requirement for there to be a trust connection there, but you could easily set up a thin layer on your own site to set up this trust connection between the XConnect server and your own API to talk to XConnect, to start feeding it more data from lots of disparate services, which can then be analyzed and then fed into the whole experience platform system. The storage architecture I mentioned earlier, XConnect is storing into SQL Server 2016 directly. It's no longer using, or it's currently not using Mongo. Mongo support will be coming, so will Cosmos DB. This means that there's a new provider. There's a new provider model in for use in this, which lets this all be interchangeable and changed out. It is a standalone layer, service layer. It's built in .NET Core 2, which means that you can deploy it in a PaaS type environment. all the user's OData for the protocol for the RESTful APIs if you need to talk between them. I mentioned GDPR earlier, the General Data Protection Regulation, and the right to be forgotten. It's built in, so if you need to remove some data for a particular user, it's much more easier, and you can build additional modules for different markets if you so require. There's some good posts on this from Jason Wilkerson. Suggest you go take a look. He's got a series of posts in there. Mentioned it is a separate service, so it will require an additional site in IIS, and obviously on the file system, especially locally. And since it's using SQL Server at the moment, it will add some additional databases. Web Forms for Marketers. Fortunately, Web Forms for Marketers is now dead. So we have a brand new Forms module. It's built directly into the platform. It's not a standalone add-on anymore. It's got all that stuff that you would hope it had. It's drag and drop. It's responsive. It's been completely rewritten from the ground up. So it's not Web Forms for Marketers 9. It is completely brand new module. It has things like multi-page forms, so if you need multi-step wizards and that kind of stuff, you can now do that. It's not Web Forms for Marketers, like I said, but Web Forms for Marketers will be supported until Sitecore 9.1, so you can download and upgrade your Web Forms for Marketers on Sitecore 9. There is no upgrade path from Web Forms for Marketers to the new Forms module at the moment, but hopefully something in the future. There's also a new marketing automation interface. This is really nice. It's drag and drop. It kind of reminds me of those old ETL tools from SQL Server. You can just drag and drop stuff into here. It's really responsive, really simple to use. You can just start dragging and dropping bits from this toolbox, and it will tell you, it will sort of guide you into where you can place these different types of actions and listeners and that kind of stuff. Have a play with this. It is this is going to make marketers' lives really easy. It's no longer uses Silverlight. It's using Speak 3, which is Angular based, so it will work across all the different browsers. A whole heap of conditions out of the box, fully integrated with XConnect, or integrate nicely with the Forms module as well. Then there's also the concept of live events, which you can code up yourself. So if you needed something to happen immediately and not via the processing server in the background, then you can fire those. Just be a bit careful that you don't go crazy with them and start eating up all the server bandwidth. This JavaScript Services was announced a few months back. It's a new headless development methodology. It's built for front-end developers and allow them to work in any IDE on any operating system and disconnected from Sitecore. They can work in a code-first approach if they wanted to. It's optional, but if they wanted to work code-first, disconnected from Sitecore, it's possible. It will allow personalization from the JavaScript modules. It is currently in tech preview, so go have a play with it. Give them feedback. You can currently use the React framework with JSS. They will be developing this further and most likely add support for Angular and Vue. If you can't get it working, you might have a licensing issue. It does require a consumption-based license, but particularly at the moment, speak to your account manager, and I'm sure they'll be able to sort something out to allow you to use it. I won't go too much into it, but go have a look at the documentation. It's really good. It's very, very extensive, particularly for us non-front-enders. I'd suggest reading the JSS for Sitecore.net developers section. For the front-enders, have a look at the intro sections just as a quick start. There are a whole bunch of samples and stuff, and simple samples, advanced samples. Go have a play. It's really, really exciting. It will allow single-page apps and responsive apps to be developed with Sitecore natively. So something to watch out for in the future. A bunch of other stuff in the background which hasn't got so much noise around it. There's a whole bunch of abstractions being made, as I have been doing with several things in the last few releases. They've been cleaning up a whole bunch of code in the background. They've been removing all the stuff that was marked obsolete before. If you haven't removed those before, you might want to go check those now. They've bundled up the requests in the experience editor, so it loads a lot faster. It's 0.5 meg less weight in the CSS and the JavaScript files. 8.2 had 254 HTTP requests. 9.0 is down to 72 HTTP requests on initial startup. They've done this by making some of the ribbons lazy loaded, so they won't load the ribbons until you actually click on the tabs, which makes a lot of sense if you're not using most of them most of the time. They have changed one of the pipelines. The HTTP request pipeline now fires from the on-post authentication HTTP module event. It was previously from the on-begin event. So if you have any specific code around that in your project, then just be careful, be aware of that one. For most people, I'd say it doesn't make much of a difference, but at least it will allow us to have user context in the HTTP request pipeline now, since it's on the on-post authentication event. Device detection and experience acceleration, the SXA, Sitecore Experience Accelerator, are now included as part of the platform for free if you're on the consumption-based license. So if you are on a consumption-based license, then upgrade, go ahead, start using those straight away. Will make your life a lot easier. There's lots of new documentation. Just head on over to doc.sitecore.net, click the Developer Center link, and the new documentation is really, really nice. They've got sections for everything. It's like the Helix documentation. So it's a nice index type file on the left, and very, very clean and very, very easy to follow. But be careful that the Sitecore 9 documentation is from that link and not on the old doc site, if you like. Some quick things they mentioned in the symposium, stuff coming up. Sitecore Cortex, slated for release in Q1 of 2018. It's machine learning for Sitecore in the background. So it will go do machine learning over all your analytics data. The concept of this is obviously, it's just amazing. I think this will do so much for the marketers. They will love this. They were talking about things like Cortex being able to identify what the best paths are within your site automatically, or identifying new personas that you may have not thought about, because whole groups of people are following these, but it will just automatically almost tell you what those personas could be or should be. And hopefully in the future it might get clever enough to be able to start doing automated personalization almost. There was also some, at the very end, there was also some talk of Project Horizon and Project Zenith. It was done by Niels Hanberg, who is a new director of user experience. And the idea behind this was drag and drop for the experience editor, essentially. Looked really, really nice. Hoping it'll be out it's probably not going to be out anytime soon, but something to watch out for in the future. It will allow things like responsive, being able to see your pages using responsive designs in the experience editor directly. And there's also some other concepts around being able to create pages using almost a tree like structure, and then extending that cortex and all that analytics that you're collecting further, and being able to actually use things like heat maps to see what parts of your site are people actually looking at and what parts of your site are people actually interacting with most, and then feeding that with analytics, and then you can feed that back into Cortex to be able to personalize and run A/B tests or accept A/B tests and that kind of stuff. So Zenith itself there's also talk of Zenith as a slightly separate project, but that's more around headless content again, which several of these other things have been pushing on. SXA, Commerce 9 is due for release very, very soon, which is built on .NET Core 2. It's a whole brand new architecture from the ground up. There's no old commerce stuff left. Along with that, there'll be a new SXA storefront, so you can just use SXA to really, really quickly build a site. See, being SXA, it'll be multi-tenanted and Helix-based, so it's using a lot of good practices in the background. Right, that's me. That's it. That's me with all the new stuff of the mammoth run of huge amounts of stuff in the Sitecore 9. I haven't touched a whole bunch of stuff in here, but you can see there's a lot of things to explore. There's a lot of new things to learn. There's a lot of new things to configure and set up our teams with, but I think it's exciting. I think there's a lot of stuff which will help us in the longer term as well. Does anybody have any questions?
Any questions? Somebody may ask. I suppose not at this point.
Not at this point, still to explore.
Yeah. Please. I mean,
tell me more about
okay.
the XDB thing. Like, is it now? It's not any MongoDB anymore. Something like that.
Can you come forward? Yeah, you can hear you.
Yep.
We wanted you to elaborate a little bit on, I think, XDB and where that would be, seeing as initially we said, I think it's not going to be on Mongo right now.
Yeah, that's right. So they've moved to a provider-based model. So kind of like how the content search API works. You program against an API, a content search API, and then you switch it out in config, whether you want to use Solr or whether you want to use Lucene or whether you want to use Azure. So they've now moved to a provider-based model. So currently only supports SQL Server. The next updates, I believe, will support Mongo again, and Cosmos DB as well. So you'll just switch it out in configuration, whether you want to use Mongo or whether you want to use SQL Server or you want to use Cosmos. I think it makes sense, and I think this would have been the better option in the first place, instead of just going down the Mongo route. There's been a lot of people who struggle with Mongo in a enterprise environment. I think supporting and maintaining it.
I have one question. We would like to know more about XConnect. Like, do we need to do any extra configuration to set up, or it comes as part of Sitecore installation itself?
It comes as part of Sitecore installation. You'll obviously need a analytics enabled, XDB enabled license. You do have to install it as a secondary site. It's it's a .NET Core based application. But if you're installing it with CIF and in a standalone mode, essentially, you will be able to install it all on your own site. So I installed it locally using this CIFless tool, and so I was able to install the whole thing within about 15 or 20 minutes, and it created the Sitecore site and the XConnect site, and it set up all the certificates and things locally as well.
Okay, why XConnect, right? We had a good life where we are working where all the data is being pushed to the MongoDB, and we had the services collecting all the data to the reporting database. Yeah. And we were able to create all our marketing reports, analytics report out of that. Why we are seeing that XConnect is the big thing with Sitecore 9? What are the tangible benefits that we are going to get out of XConnect framework?
So the problem with old XDB was it was very much tied to Sitecore. You would need, if you wanted to talk to XDB, you had to talk to it via a Sitecore site, right? So it had to be via a CD instance or a CMS instance. So everything was happening via the Sitecore kernel. The new XConnect service, it is a separate site. It's a service layer that sits in between Sitecore and XDB, the databases, and it's built on .NET Core 2. There's no dependencies on Sitecore, so you can have that running on a separate server or a separate set of servers. You can scale that separately, and it's then also not affecting your Sitecore license, because you're able to scale that as a separate instance in PaaS if you wanted to. It's a .NET Core application. You could run that in PaaS, and you can scale that separately. And then if you want to connect non-Sitecore things to XConnect and collect analytics on that, you could. So whether that's mobile apps, non-Sitecore sites, IoT devices, you can start feeding all of this data into XConnect much more easily using these REST APIs, which sit on top of XConnect. You couldn't do that with the old XDB. You had to go and create a whole bunch of custom stuff running via your Sitecore instance.
I mean, does that mean that we won't be needing FXM anymore?
Depends what you were doing with FXM. If you were just using FXM to collect analytics, then I guess not, yeah. But if you were using FXM to do things like personalization on a non-Sitecore site, then you're still going to need to use FXM for those instances.
Okay, thanks.
We would like to know more about marketing automation, which we have it in Sitecore 9. So what are the possibilities it is giving us?
So the marketing automation replaces the whatever the old one was. Again, this is built as a separate instance. Let me just show you if I can pull this up, see if I'm logged in still. Marketing automation, I think it largely does the same as what the old one did, but it's no longer using Silverlight. So you can now, here you go. Build this up. Marketing automation. There you go. So it's no longer using Silverlight. It's all done using Speak 3, which is an Angular-based app. There's a whole bunch of actions and things out of the box. You can start going in, and it's as easy as this to decide whether you want to how you add things in. It's really, really nice. You can go in, you can start affecting those, and as you start to use this tool, you'll see that icons are changing. It's just much nicer, I think, for for the user and for the marketers, I think it's actually becomes a tool that they can use with that much help. It drives, it's very, very intuitive. You can do things like here's, I've created a campaign from earlier. Let me remove that. I can just remove it, and it just works as you'd expect it to work, without having much effort. I haven't used this much myself. I'm much more on the technology side, but I was able to just pick this up very, very quickly after one single demo at Symposium, and just like, wow, this is really, really nice. It's really, really easy to extend. You can go create your own actions and your own listeners. I had added a listener here, for example. I could then go start making this driven from the rules engine. Hopefully this is familiar to most of you guys. It's the same rules engine that's used in throughout the rest of Sitecore. So you can see it's really, really nice and easy to use. There's also a concept of live events. You have to code these up yourself, but if there were certain things that you needed to occur immediately as a user is running actions on the site, then you can code up what's known as live events. So it will just fire immediately. Like if a user had gone and signed up for something and you wanted to fire them an email immediately for some reason, or go increment something and give them a discount coupon, for example, you can use live events to do this, and this wasn't possible to do using the old tool. So this has had an extensive rewrite. Unfortunately, I don't think there is an upgrade path from the old one to this new one. So if you have a lot of automation in the old one, you're going to have to shift them across manually, as far as I know, which is not good. But hopefully, going forward, it'll make your lives a lot easier.
About the JSS, is it out of the box, or do we need a separate installation or a separate license?
You need a consumption-based license. It is a separate installation. It's currently in technical beta, so it's not out of the box, but it is a separate license, and you will need a consumption-based license. If you don't have a consumption-based license, then speak to your sales rep, is what I've been told, and they should be able to do something for you at the moment. I think it's because of the way that you could potentially use JSS to render the front-end stuff and possibly cache things in between, that it needs to be on a consumption-based license, because otherwise you could just make a whole bunch of Sitecore servers redundant, essentially.
One last question. So, if you are migrating from 8.2 to 9, and what about that MongoDB data? How is it any plan or category now?
Yeah. There is a migration tool, so you can move from Mongo to SQL Server. I don't know if you'll be able to switch from SQL Server back to Mongo later on if you decided that it was wrong, but there currently is a migration tool. So you won't lose all that data, luckily.
Okay. What about WFM upgrade path? What would we do with the WFM data?
Yeah. So at the moment there is no upgrade path from WFFM to the new forms module. You can upgrade from 8.2 to 9 and install the WFFM 9 module. So you don't currently lose any data. In 9.1, they're going to completely stop with WFFM. It's not going to be supported from 9.1 onwards. I'm hoping at that point that they'll at least have a migration tool for the WFFM to forms module. So I'm hoping that they're working on something in the background, and that's what people are suggesting within the community. But let's see.
Okay.
All right. So the house has any more questions, I guess we can reach out to Kamruz directly. All of you are definitely aware of how to reach him, and you can reach him at the time.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter or Slack, or just get my email from and then there it's fine. And I'll share these slides out so you guys can read through them at your own time. And I know there's a bunch of links and stuff in there, so I'll share these out with you guys soon.
That'd be very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kamruz, for taking the time from your night at this point. Thank you so much for actually helping us learn all these things. And most of us, I think, did not make it to the symposium, so this was a really great introduction.
Yeah. Hope it was useful, guys, and enjoy the rest of your user group.
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks.
All right.
Bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.